Where does God live? If you listen to those readings today, all 4 readings that we had from the Bible today, you got at least 5 or 6 answers to that question. Where does God live? I'm going to start with Solomon because we haven't been talking much about the saga of David and his followers. And so I'm going to repaint for you that image you heard today of King Solomon finally building the temple that David had hoped to build for God, and Solomon finally did it. Now, if you read all of the stories about Solomon in the Bible, the stuff that the lectionary people didn't include, you'll know that Solomon ascended to the throne in a rather ruthless manner. He murdered his wife and his brother-in-law because he believed they were scheming against him. And then he enslaved all of his people, took their goods and their bodies, and made them build this temple for him for free. And that's the precursor to this big moment where Solomon's having this great God moment with God. So remember, they built this fancy temple. This is the first church, the first synagogue, the first dwelling place for God as in a building, an edifice. And it's very fancy. If you read 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, you'll just read how lush the accoutrements were in this fancy temple. And he's got the priests and the generals, the armies, and all the fancy people who are coming to this big moment. And then the presence of God fills the temple in such a way, in a cloud-like way, that everybody has to leave the temple. The priests can't even get inside the building to offer the sacrifices that they've been preparing, because God, in a cloud-like way, has somehow filled this entire temple. And then he utters really the most remarkable prayer. Now, it's not remarkable for kings in that time to offer prayers. Now they'd probably call in a bishop or, some religious leader. But in those times, kings would often offer prayers to God to sort of reseal the covenant, say, that's right, we remember that we were not faithful before, but now we are going to be faithful, and I swear this to you as the king of this land, and wants everybody to hear it. But here's what's unique about this prayer. First of all, he says to God, I have built this house for you at your instruction. And then he says, but I know that this house cannot contain you because you are far greater than heaven or earth. Now that's a very interesting thing to say, because in the entire history of the Jewish people, up to this exact moment in history, they had God in a box. Quite literally, God in the Ark of the Covenant. So the 10 Commandments were in there in the form of tablets, and it was literally a box. You can see pictures of this box in Bible history dictionaries. And they carried it with them when they went into battle. And God would say, bring the Ark with you, I will be with you in that box, like my power center. And it was considered sort of their nuclear weapon. If God was in that box with them, they were going to win that battle. And if God wasn't, they were not going to win that battle. So here he's now built the Holy of Holies, a temple, put the Ark of the Covenant in there. So now God is bigger than a box. God is in the temple. But he already goes beyond that and says, no, I know that nothing can contain you, not even this temple I have built for you. And then the other thing that he says is he prays for other people. He prays for strangers. He says, when other people, strangers to you, come to this temple, or strangers to our land, please accept their prayers. Please answer their prayers so that they will know that you are here, how great God is. That is also a remarkable prayer. There's no other time before that in the Bible when somebody said, please hear the prayers of strangers. And then he also prays about the past, the present, and the future. If you think about that, most of the time you pray for a present need. Please heal this thing. Please make this better. Please do this right now for this problem I have right now. But first, Solomon, in order to say, I am Solomon the Great, just like King David before me, says to God, please remember your servant David. I'm his son, and you said you would keep his lineage going, so I'm the guy. So remember the past. Then he prays for the present. Please help us to be a faithful people. Please protect us. And then he does an interesting thing. He prays about the future. He says, and when we go astray, because he's already predicted that he, in fact, is going to become a polytheist again. He says, when we go astray, please forgive us. Don't destroy us. That's a pretty unusual prayer. That is not a normal thing to say in a prayer. So it's quite remarkable. I don't think he could have predicted that that temple would be destroyed in 539 before the Common Era BC, when the Babylonians came and conquered the Israelites. I don't think he knew that all that hard work was going to get destroyed. So, people thought that God lived in the temple. And then it was destroyed, and they thought, oh no, where's God now? And they kept praying to that God during the Babylonian exile. Then King Darius allowed them to rebuild the temple. Is it Cyrus? Sorry, I get the two mixed up. They rebuilt the temple, and then it was destroyed again in 70 after the birth of Jesus, the year 70. God can't possibly live in temples because they keep getting destroyed. And yet we keep building them and calling them houses of God. Why is that? If that's not actually where God lives. Well, in my opinion, we build them because we experience God in temples. And sometimes the more extravagant and elaborate they are, they have an ability to draw us out of ourselves and to bring us to a new place with God. So I'll give you an example. When I was 24 years old, I went to Europe for the first time with my then husband, and we went to Paris. We started and ended our trip in Paris. And he was a historian really interested in all the Nazi bullets in the buildings, and I wanted to go to Notre Dame. I wanted to go to the great temple, and I wanted to pray. He was not religious. I was very Catholic at the time, too. So we go to Notre Dame, and I'm thinking I'm going to have this really cool experience in this fancy, fancy temple. And what it was full of was people from all over the world. It was a tourist trap. I was a tourist, too. And so they said, you know, the English tour will begin in 15 minutes. And here was the Japanese tour, and the Dutch tour, and the Spanish tour, and the, Ethiopian tour. And I couldn't believe it. It was so loud, and I could hear all these voices. It was like being in Times Square, never hearing English, just hearing this cacophony of voices in a variety of languages, and everybody saying, and now you will see the frame to the flying buttresses. This symbolizes whatever, and as you look upward, you experience God. And I was so irritated and disappointed. I thought, this isn't spiritual at all. But then I sat down in a pew somewhere mid-church, and some people were getting ready for a mass, and there was all sorts going on, and looking at the lovely golden accoutrement up on the altar. And then I started to pray, just sitting with my husband beside me and silently talking to God. And I prayed for a relative with mental illness and substance abuse issues that I'd been praying for fervently much of my life. And it was one of those desperate prayers, an anxious prayer. I was saying, please, God, please, 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 would you fix it? Please, please. And I felt agitation, as I always did when praying for this relative, because it just never seemed to get better, the mental illness or the substance abuse. And after about 2 minutes, something pretty remarkable happened. I felt this lightness. I felt lifted, not physically lifted, but something in me mentally was lifted, and I felt like I was lifted up above the noise and the cacophony of all those tours going on in various languages. Didn't notice my husband. I didn't notice anything except that God had silenced the voice going, please, God, please, please. And I was in the presence of God. Just lightness of being. And all of the fret and worry and pain went away. And instead what I experienced was peace. And while I didn't hear the message, I got the message. Everything is all right. Now, from that relative's point of view, everything is not all right and still hasn't. But that relative is still alive, and I am all right about it. I am all right that I can't fix it. I am all right. I don't suffer the way I did I don't say please, please, please anymore. That's gone. So to me, God dwelled in that place. A lot of it was, of course, it was going in my head, and nobody else experienced this. But nevertheless, the glory filled the temple for me. I had that moment. It was almost as if God said, you think I can't talk above the rabble of the tours? Of course I can. I'm God. So God just kind of went, boom. And I had that peace, and by the way, like an everlasting peace. Well, by the time, so there's a purpose to the buildings, is what I'm saying. I'm not dissing religious buildings. We all have experienced the Holy Spirit in this place, for example. They're for us to talk to God and to find God. But in the New Testament, we all of a sudden have a totally different concept of where God lives, and this is new. Jesus says it in the gospel, I abide in you, and you in me. God dwells in you. I live in you. Now that's a pretty radical concept. We say it when we start our prayers, the Eucharistic prayer and other prayers, like at the beginning of our service. I say, the Lord be with you, and you say, and also with you. And that actually means God is in you. So in the New Zealand Book of Prayer, they make it very clear. They don't say the Lord be with you. They say God dwells in you. And then the people say back, and also in you. So let's try that. God dwells in you.
And also in you.
Thank you. See, that just makes me feel shivery inside that you think that about me. And that I assert that about you. I know it about you because God says it's true. Now here's the question. If God lives in the house in our head, so remember we're going back to our head as a house, back to 2 sermons ago, how much room have we given God? Is God stuck in the closet, in the old shoebox? Does God have the nicest guest room? Does God get to eat anything in the fridge? Does God get to sit at the head of the table? How much space does God get in us if God actually dwells in us? Interestingly, in the Gospels, God is compared a couple of times to a thief who's going to break into your house. Remember that? In Matthew 24 and Luke 13, it says God's going to come like a thief in the night when you least expect him. So, if you don't want to let God in, God's going to break in anyway. But my sense, and I have talked to God about this, is that God would prefer that you just open the door and let her in. I think she would prefer that. I've had the experience of God breaking down the doors. You probably have had too. But I have noticed it goes easier for me in my life if I just say, come on in. Now the question is, why would we not let God in? So once again, your head is your house and you're letting God in or out. Why would you not let God in? My suspicion is that for some of us, first of all, we fear the judgment of God, that if God sees the mess that is our head, that we've actually had ugly thoughts, that we don't pray every moment of the day, that we hoard our goods and don't give them all to charity, that God will find out what a mess we are. It's like, we can't invite God over yet because the house is a mess. Wait till I've had a weekend to clean it. But God is like that relative who says, I don't care. I've seen your mess. My house is messy. Well, God's house isn't messy, but I've seen mess. I get it. Just let me in. Then the other fear, I think, is that God is going to take over. God is going to ask something of us we don't want. God is going to just say, I get the master bedroom and the living room, and you can watch TV half an hour a day, Janine. We don't want God to really take over, do we? No, not really, because it's our house. But if we think about it, when we actually have had God take over our lives in some way, it's turned out well, hasn't it? It really has. That God is not actually trying to cause us harm, but only means good towards us. So why wouldn't we throw open our doors? The Benedictine monk Thomas Keating, who is famous for writing about centering prayer, which is also meditation or contemplative prayer, it's all kind of one of the same thing. And he talks about different stages of letting God into your house, the house being our mind. So he talks about God being very far away, that distant general who may or may not hear your request someday. And then there's the God who gets a little bit nearer. You're starting to trust God. God becomes more friend-like. And then there's the God in you, which is sort of the one we're talking about. God dwells in you. And then he says, at the last stage, God is you. Now that can seem appalling and controversial to people because it sounds like we're saying that we are God, thus we have all the privileges and powers of God. But it doesn't actually mean that. What it means is that we have so surrendered ourselves to the light and presence of God that our ego goes completely away. Our beingness, our Janine-ness, our Aquila-ness, our Barbara-ness goes away, and we are God. In my experience with any Christian, including people like Thomas Keating and people of other, walks of life besides Christianity, I've never seen anybody who fully embodies God all the time. But what I do think we can experience regularly are those moments when God touches us and so lifts us out of whatever difficulty or darkness within, that we experience it as all God. And no matter how brief it is, it's transforming. If we just let it happen, if we kneel in the crowded church and say, please, 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 and just let God in some way. So how do you invite God in? Well, prayer is the obvious one, right? So prayer is the obvious way of asking for God's presence, sensing God's presence, asking God to help us in that presence. And so you can simply start with the simple prayer, I invite you into me, God, to take over, to live in me, and to help me with whatever it is I need help with. And you can pray however, quick, while you're waiting for the red light. It can be meditation, it can be walking, it can be whatever you want. Petting the dog is one of my favorites. I pet the dog, she calms me down, and I just say, hi, God. It can be as simple as, hi, God. There you are in my living room again. Yes, you may say the blessing at dinner. But I want to suggest an even better way. You say, God dwells in you to the people you think are the most godless people in the universe. Because in my experience, the way to make the home bigger, make it a big mansion that you're inviting God to, the way I get bigger in my head about God is that I pull down the walls of people that I think are the strangers that God wouldn't want to listen to. Remember Solomon's prayer? And listen to the strangers, God, and answer their prayers, because you are the God of them too. So you have to imagine the people who are painted as the most godless and evil, and say in your head, God dwells in you. God dwells in the Taliban. I know. That's not what the news is telling us, but God dwells in the Taliban. And if that is appalling, then remember that Jesus said in the Gospels today, do you find what I'm saying appalling? It is. The gospel is appalling. The gospel takes us farther than we possibly would ever want to go, because that's where God is. And I guarantee you that if you can say that to the people you think are the worst, the most godless people, that this will open the floodgates to God. I think I've got the wrong metaphor there. It will just open the doors wide open and let all of God come rushing in. God dwells in you. Thank you.